The initial pitch of an Avengers game created by the developers of the Tomb Raider remakes was exciting. The Tomb Raider reboot game had been such an amazing action platformer dungeon crawler type game. In the same way that Ratchet & Clank and Sunset Overdrive proved why Insomniac was perfect for Spider-Man, I thought that Tomb Raider was proof that we'd get a really solid superhero game from Crystal Dynamics. But I was so wrong. For a long time, it was a running joke on comic Twitter that the game was never coming.
After a million years since that preview, then what feels like no time at all since that demo.
Because as far as 2 years after it was announced, we still hadn't seen anything from it.
Dad went to 7-Eleven to get scratchers. I guess he won because that was 6 years ago.
No gameplay, no trailer, no announcements, just no news at all. And if you followed games as long as I have, you know that that's never a good sign. It shows a complete lack of faith in the product from the developer and the publisher. We've got to give some context to what was going on at Marvel Comics when the game was in development, as well as what was going on in the game industry in general. So let's flash back to 2017. Avengers was announced in January of 2017, and Marvel was in the middle of trying to write the X-Men out of existence. Now, why is that relevant to an Avengers video? Because at the time, Marvel was trying to use the Inhumans to replace the X-Men. Marvel was shoving the Inhumans into every project they could to try and make the idea of the Inhumans being the new X-Men stick. They showed up in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and they tried to kill all the X-Men in a crossover comic. They even got their own show, which had its first episode filmed in IMAX and premiered in theaters for some reason. Marvel pushed the Inhumans hard, but out of all the Inhuman characters, the most popular was Ms. Marvel. The push for Inhumans between 2014 and 2018 seems to be a big part of why they're so prominent in the game. It's brand synergy. But in 2019, Disney bought 20th Century Fox, who had the rights to all the X-Men characters. Characters who are still drastically more popular than the Inhumans. The X-Men characters are so much more popular that the MCU iteration of Ms. Marvel has been foreshadowed as being a mutant instead of an Inhuman like her comic book and video game counterparts. So by the time the game launched in 2020, all of that effort to push the Inhumans was null and moot. The corporate overlords had already decided to abandon that idea. But by that point, the game had already been in development for at least 3 years. So there really wasn't much they could do to change things by the time the game launched. Knowing all of that makes the final product feel so much more synthetic and corporate than it already is. But honestly, I think that it could have been worse. So here's my swim theory on that. Remember the Star Wars Battlefront 2 fiasco? No? I'll sum it up for you. Battlefront 1 had a ton of microtransactions and got raked through the coals for it, but it made so much money that they doubled down on it in Battlefront 2. And doubling down on it blew up in everyone's faces. Battlefront 2 was the worst kind of game in terms of microtransactions and loot boxes. Don't believe me? We'll take it from these YouTubers instead.
The Star Wars Battlefront 2 loot box fiasco is no doubt one of the biggest gaming controversies of all time.
Because companies are constantly trying to find the most effective way to monetize their games without directly raising the price.
So a company could find itself asking, how can we get people to keep spending money in our game, even after they've gotten what they want, without creating more stuff?
Put in these dumbass loot boxes.
So the long and short of it is this. While prices on nearly everything else have gone up due to inflation, the retail cost of video games has stayed the same since the 1990s. But even though video games are still $60 for us, they've become more and more expensive to develop. But the era of mobile gaming introduced the game industry to a whole new method of monetization.
What if we create a system where players can make smaller purchases but without any limit on how many? Let's reward players paying real money with blatant advantages over those cheap bastards who won't give us money. I've got you beat, Chad. Let's do all that, but in a slot machine.
The in-game purchases within Battlefront 2 are in many cases pay to win and are implemented so strongly into the game that they have become an integral part of the upgrading and leveling process.
Battlefront 2 is very black and white about this. You either have the star cards that make you win, or you have nothing and you suck dick.
The loot box is designed to remove the element of choice from your purchasing decision, instead rewarding you with a random item.
These items are not guaranteed. They are open in the same manner one would with the slot machines in Vegas.
Here, they have turned unlocks way the fuck down in the hopes that people would just get frustrated and buy their upgrades with real money.
It's an unfortunate mix of necessity and greed that brought about Battlefront 2's monetization situation. If you were doing a cost-benefit analysis on making a video game, then you would find that it costs more money to create and maintain maintain a multiplayer game, but there's also a lot more potential to monetize a multiplayer experience in ways that you just can't monetize a single player game. It's a higher risk for the publisher, but that also means a much higher reward. Are you getting how this relates to Avengers yet?
In reality, EA probably set targets for a games as a service system with goals for player retention and player spending that they were looking to achieve.
The game was designed to make the grind a non-fun experience in the hopes that the average consumer, one that paid $60 for the game, will eventually cave and pull out their credit card.
They would then hire and assign engagement designers to come up with a system that works for the game and has the best chance at maximizing profitability.
EA will look at how pissed consumers are over microtransactions and not really bat an eye. But when you have this being so egregiously done on a property as big as Star Wars, it becomes a larger story. This caused multiple news outlets to make stories on the backlash EA was receiving.
Pay-to-win system pissed people off so bad that EA actually retracted the ability to buy your upgrades temporarily.
Disney, who owns Star Wars, told them to do it. Spicy.
The ramifications of Star Wars Battlefront 2 were that legislators in multiple countries decided to send a message to the games industry. That message being, fix your shit or we will regulate you into the ground. Now, while all that was going on, Marvel's Avengers was in the middle of development, which makes me think the game was originally going to be a lot more microtransaction heavy than it already is. Think about the price point on skins in games like Injustice and Arkham Knight. It would only be $5 or $10 for a skin pack with about 3 to 5 skins each. But for Avengers, it was like $20 for a single skin. That's the price of a whole ass Marvel Legends action figure. And they want $20 for skins in a video game where all the skins look like absolute shit. And even the skins that don't look crappy are just recycling assets from other skins. Like this one that just adds Thor's cape to Iron Man. And think about the rarity system for all the collectibles. You know how there's all this gear and all of these items and all this loot with rarity levels that you can pretty much ignore and never really becomes relevant in the gameplay? What if all of that stuff was baked into the game early on, and it's all a leftover from when the game was based on loot boxes? I mean, $20 skins? What were they thinking?
What were they thinking?
That tells me they were expecting a huge profit margin on the game coming from loot boxes and skin gambling. And the rarity system kind of points in that direction. And the price points for skins do too. So my guess is that after the Battlefront 2 fiasco, Disney told Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix that they couldn't do loot boxes anymore. But because they had already invested so much money into that system, they had to find some way to make that money back. And they were so desperate to make up that loss that they tried to make up the difference by charging out the ass for skins. This isn't something that just impacted Star Wars games and Avengers. Games like Marvel Heroes Omega were delisted and taken offline altogether. Marvel Heroes is a game that was and still is very much beloved by the comic book community. But it's also an example of Marvel trying to cash in on the games as a service model early on. If the Battlefront 2 controversy resulted in a game like Marvel Heroes Omega getting delisted, then it definitely impacted the course of development for a game like Avengers. So you know what that means for the folks at home? Now instead of paying $50 for 10 loot boxes and getting 10 shit skins, you can just pay $20 for the skin you wanted. Because Square Enix really needs to make back the money on this apparently. But wait, what's that?
That's the second time you've used that death sound effect this video. It's starting to get old.
Your retention rate
is going to go down. Besides,
you haven't even started talking about the game itself yet.
Just talk about the gameplay, dude.
But that's enough video game conspiracies for now. We've spent like 10 minutes talking about video games in general, but we haven't actually talked about the game that the video is about, so let's get into that. There are two things I'm going to focus on when I talk about the game. The level design and the gameplay for the characters on an individual basis. Those are the best and worst parts about the game. And the through line between the gameplay and level design are the traversal mechanics. And somehow I think that's where the game really excels. Grappling as Miss Marvel or Hawkeye or Black Widow feels spot on. And when you throw Thor's hammer at an enemy and the enemy just gets stuck in place behind it, it's the best feeling. You know that donkey meme, makes you feel like Batman?
Makes you feel eerily like Batman. The player really feel like Batman. Could not look or feel more Batman. Made us feel like we were feel like Batman. IGN, what did you think?
Arkham Asylum makes you feel like you're Batman.
Well, the first time I played the A-Day mission, that was the moment that made me feel like Thor. and it's the moment that sold me on the game, and it's the dragon I've been chasing ever since. As much as I'm criticizing the game, it's only because I feel like there's something of substance underneath it all. Like there's a good game hiding underneath the bad one. And when you move around the map as these characters, whether you fly around the map as Iron Man, or Cap's shield bounces from one guy to another, or you have Thor's hammer stick a guy in place, those are the moments where the game just really shines, and I wish there were more of them. The combat and traversal mechanics are amazing, but the problem is there's no one to fight in terms of combat, and there's nowhere to go in terms of traversal. You fight hordes and hordes of generic soldiers, robots, and giant robot spiders the entire game with so little variation. There are maybe 3 supervillains you fight the entire game: Taskmaster, Abomination, and MODOK, and that's it. By the time you finished the first mission, you have fought a third of the supervillains in the game. The levels are really wide and open-ended, but at the same time, they're completely empty. They have to be big enough for a character like Hulk to jump through, or for a character like Iron Man to fly through. But they also need to have enough stuff so that characters like Cap or Widow don't feel stuck or slow in comparison. They tried to make a game that worked for all these different types of characters, but the result were levels that didn't really work for any of them. But it could have, and that's what kills me about it. There are a few levels early into the game's campaign where the single player promise of the game really shines. The levels where you're running from AIM as Kamala, the opening A-Day mission, the Iron Man solo mission, all these levels were so much fun, but it's like there's a point where the game completely abandons all that and then decides, yeah, that was cool, but here's what the game actually is. And then you're just stuck with the promise of what could have been.
Alright, on to mission 4. Oh no. Everything I've played up to this point was an extended 3-hour-long tutorial. This is the real game, isn't it?
Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened.
But there are 2 levels that I like a lot, and they're levels that I played over and over again. The Jersey City and Manhattan missions. They're so much fun. They're just these tiny little cityscapes, but they're the kind of worlds that I would want to explore and roleplay as the Avengers in. They kind of remind me of the Spider-Man 2002 game's New York City levels. But these are the kinds of levels that I want to play as the Avengers in, not these weird, generic desert snow labs. There's a reason that 90% of the clips that I filmed for the video were pulled from those 2 levels specifically. I genuinely enjoy playing these levels, and that's why I wish there were more like them. It's like I said, there's a good game hidden underneath the bad one, and the good game is in these 2 levels. They're really fun sandboxes to just fly around in. 90% of the time when I play a game like Spider-Man, I just web swing around going nowhere in general. And when I play Grand Theft Auto, I just drive around and explore the world. And I feel like the Jersey City and Manhattan levels are the only levels where you can actually do that in Avengers. And I think that's why I got the most out of those levels. So the story is okay, but honestly, I'm a little bit tired of the Avengers disassembled then reassembled plotline that keeps getting used over and over and over again. The game is just kind of frustrating to me overall as an Avengers story. But as a Ms. Marvel story, I actually think it works pretty well. Ms. Marvel is a big highlight of the game, and if you're a Ms. Marvel fan, then you're in for a real treat when it comes to the first few hours of the game. She's portrayed pretty faithfully to her comic book counterpart, and she's one of the more well-rounded characters gameplay-wise. She brings a lot of heart to the game that's absent everywhere else. There's other stuff that I find irritating about the game though, like the fact that Captain America is another one of the best characters in the game, and he's completely absent from it until the very end of the campaign. Or like I said earlier, the fact that there's only 3 supervillain boss fights. I mean, in the Spider-Man game, Spider-Man fought 6, and we get 3 here. They even do this really cheap, lame shit where you have to fight Loki, but Loki is taking the form of Thor. So you fight Loki, but you're really just fighting a Thor reskin. Another thing worth complaining about is that when the script is at its worst, it's like the writing is just a cliche attempt at aping Joss Whedon. But honestly, that stuff is a little bit typical for comic book projects nowadays, so in that regard, maybe it's a little bit in line with modern MCU flicks.
Come on, let's show Mysterio the ropes, kid. Hello. Looks like he'll be hanging around for a while.
So hot, it's practically radioactive. Thank goodness for Chef Boyardee.
It's just really frustrating to have to keep playing the same levels over and over again, and I can't even try any of the newer ones from the DLC until I level the characters up to 100? My highest level character is barely 90, and I haven't even played that version of the game in months. Yeah, so my dumbass really went out and bought 2 separate copies of the game, one on PC and one on PS4, because I guess I'm just a masochist like that. I was so excited for the game, and I had some friends who were getting it on PS4, and I had other friends who were getting it on PC, and I guess FOMO just got the better of me. So the fact that you have to level up the characters individually is frustrating alone. So imagine how frustrating it was to have to do it twice. But I did have some fun playing the game. I felt like Thor and Captain America were the real standout characters. Kamala and Widow were pretty fun to play as too, and Iron Man's good once you level him up. Panther and Hawkeye are okay, I guess. And then Spider-Man and Hulk were complete dog ass. My tier list of characters would probably look something like this.
What's going on with you, Iron Man?
Iron Man is a great example of how good characters get locked behind a skill tree. When I had him fully upgraded on PS4, he was my main. But when I restarted the game on PC, I never bothered playing as him. I was just frustrated having to start over. He felt so weak compared to what I was used to. There were so many moves and abilities locked behind his skill tree that I just did not want to grind to get to. And I feel like Widow and T'Challa have similar problems. And what if you already leveled up a character like Kate Bishop or Thor? When Jane Foster and Hawkeye get put in the game, doesn't that mean you basically have to level up the same characters all over again? That kind of grinding really makes the game feel like a chore. And like I said, characters like Hulk and Spider-Man were just so bad comparatively to the rest of the cast. Spider-Man was so frustrating, he just felt so stiff. It's like he was a barely modified Captain America Winter Soldier with some of Widow's moveset. I'll even say this, Widow, Hawkeye, and Kamala's grappling felt way more authentic than Spider-Man's cloud swinging. And honestly, I wish his web swinging worked more like that instead of what we got. I really feel like they just rushed Spider-Man out the door because they had to. The cheap comic art cutscenes are kind of a telltale sign of that. They knew at least 30% of the active player base would never actually get a chance to use the character, so at that point, why bother? If I had to guess, they probably only finished the character because they had to. They were being sued in Europe for false advertising on account of the fact that Spider-Man was announced as a PS4 exclusive. So because they were getting sued, they couldn't just cancel Spider-Man like they did all the other characters. Which brings me to another point. Something I thought was really interesting was that at one point, data miners found assets in the game code that referenced future characters, like Scarlet Witch, Vision, Doctor Strange, Ant-Man, She-Hulk, War Machine, and so many more. They really thought this game was going to be around for a few years, and I think that's why it was supported as long as it was. Which is honestly a shame, because my hottest take about the game is that there's a lot of promise in it. I want to like the game so much, but every time I try to make progress, I just get so frustrated I put it down and then don't want to pick it back up again. Honestly, it's a real shame that the game had to end up like this. If it had been a single-player game like Guardians of the Galaxy, or a co-op open-world game like Gotham Knights, I think the game would have fared a lot better. But because it was built on this weird loot box microtransaction model, and then it had to be repurposed into whatever it was after Battlefront 2 was released, the game just comes across as this hodgepodge mess of missed opportunity. But it goes back to the fact that video games can take years longer to develop than comic books or movies or TV shows. And because of that, by the time they come out, they can sort of feel a little bit dated. Especially for a company like Marvel, where they try to keep the brand synergy at a 10. So starting development on a game and taking aesthetic inspirations from something like Destiny was a failed endeavor from the very beginning. By the time Avengers came out, Anthem and Destiny 2 had already came out and completely flopped, which made Avengers look even worse by comparison. I think one of the best examples of the lack of foresight when developing the game is how they'll purposefully make the costumes look ugly. They did it in Gotham Knights and Avengers both. I'm pretty sure the only reason they did that was to make people want to buy the cooler skins later on. You ever hear about how kids will bully their friends if they use a default skin in Fortnite? I think it's that same train of logic. But then all the game's advertising and promotional material has to use these ugly looking costumes, which makes the game look even less appealing to everyone than it had beforehand, which is a big problem if everyone's already shit-talking the game. There are way better looking suits in the game, but you would never know that from the marketing and promotional material alone. So if they're making the default skins ugly on purpose, is it really that much of a surprise that the Marvel Legends based on the game ended up becoming shelf warmers? This game really is the best example of corporate greed and everything that you shouldn't do when you're trying to monetize your multi-million-dollar video game based on a multi-billion-dollar franchise. And that's a lesson that Square Enix had to learn the hard way. A lesson that cost them $200 million. And sadly, that means that good games that fans actually liked, like Guardians of the Galaxy, aren't going to get a sequel now, all on account of Avengers failures. And that means it might be even longer before another developer gets a chance to try to make another Marvel game. We'll talk a little bit more later about the economics of video game development and why these studios make the decisions they do involving monetization. TLDR, it's because the prices of developing a video game are going up, and the revenue you get from making a video game is going down. But like I said, we'll talk about that later, because I gotta rant about the art and the aesthetics of the game for a little bit first. Something I find really frustrating, and one of the most common complaints about both Gotham Knights and Avengers, was just the general video game aesthetic of them. They didn't look like comic games, they looked like comic books that were translated into video games. What I'm saying is that these feel like the video game equivalent of these. If you go back to the 360 PS3 generation, every video game had the same kind of style and aesthetic. There were all these shepherd infamous looking dudes with shaved heads, and all these generic enemies that had gas masks and trench coats and tactical armor plating. And every game from that generation feels like it took place in a desert, or the generic gray ruins of some city, or some generic gray post-apocalypse. Everything just looks so gray and dark and dull. There was no color in these worlds, no life, no heart, no fucking soul. And while graphic fidelity and realism aren't as important to gamers nowadays, back then it made all the difference in the world. Now there was cultural context for why every game looked like this. Back in the PS3 360 era, the biggest buzzword in video games was graphics. And while graphic fidelity and realism aren't as important to video games nowadays, back then it made all the difference in the world. It was just easier to make these realistic-looking desert post-apocalyptic wastelands than it was to make realistic forests or realistic cities. Ever hear about how there's a big gray monster fight at the end of every superhero movie? Nando V Movies has a great video about it here. But the reason they do that is because when you're making CGI, it's easier to make gray look realistic than it is any other color. Just think about it. Doomsday, Ironmonger, Ultron, Hades, Abomination, they're all giant gray monsters. But it's for that exact same reason that games like Call of Duty, Halo Reach, and Gears of War all take place in these ugly, empty, open gray desert worlds. What really sucks is that some of these outdated video game aesthetics stick around in the modern day like a sore thumb. I'm going to show you an example of what I'm talking about. So Arkham Asylum comes out and it breaks all the typical norms that you would expect from a AAA licensed title. It embraced this creepy, moody aesthetic that not even the Silent Hill games of the era could pull off. It was one of the first comic book video games in a long time to really feel like a comic book game, not just a cheap licensed tie-in product. Not a comic book translated into a video game, but a video game that looked like a comic and felt like a comic and wasn't afraid of the source material that it was based on. And then Arkham City came out and it had the exact same vibe. And when you look at the concept art for Arkham City, you can tell there was a clear intention to make a comic book video game with comic book aesthetics. And then Arkham fucking Knight came out and threw all of that out the door. Arkham Knight was supposed to be a big console seller for PS4, and I guess because of that they wanted to embrace the graphic fidelity on account of it being a new console generation and all. But in my opinion, all it did was take away from the aesthetics of the first two games. Going from Arkham City to Arkham Knight, you lose all the style and aesthetics that are in the start screens, the pause screens, the menu, and you trade it all in for this super generic looking UI. And then you realize it's not just the UI. Batman's Batsuit, the Batmobile, all of the enemy designs, none of them look like Batman designs anymore. They just look like generic video game characters. Joker? I hardly know her. It turns Arkham Knight from a Batman game into another generic Gears of War, Fallout, Borderlands infamous take on a Batman game. My main frustrations with recent superhero games is that they don't look or feel like comic book games anymore. Even Insomniac's Spider-Man villains kind of suffer from that over-designed video game aesthetic that I'm talking about. Shocker and Vulture come to mind especially, even though they aren't nearly as bad as what we saw in Enix Avengers, Arkham Knight, or especially in Gotham Knights. It's like comic book video games feel like they have to copy the trends in video games as a whole, and I think that really holds them back, because what they should be doing is embracing the comic book aesthetics from comic books and then putting that into a video game world. And given that it can take 5 to 8 years to develop a video game like Suicide Squad is going to be trying to keep up with the standards and ideas from 5 years ago, even though games like Gotham Knights and Avengers have already proven why the games as a service model doesn't work at all for these franchises. So that means that a game like Suicide Squad is already outdated before it even hit its first delay, let alone by the time the game actually releases. But developers are going to keep doubling down on trying to find new ways to monetize their video games. And that's because the cost of developing a video game continues to skyrocket. Meanwhile, the price of a video game has stayed mostly stagnant since the 90s. But games like Avengers were set up for failure in more ways than one. This is a game that was delayed so many times, by the time it was actually released, it had the unfortunate coincidence of releasing right in the middle of the Marvel Fortnite season. Fortnite had a Marvel season that lasted a couple of months long. All the rewards were Marvel skins and Marvel items. And the map had all these different superpowers you could use and all these different Marvel locations you could visit. Fortnite just continued to be one of the most popular games in the world, and Avengers releasing alongside it did nothing to change that fact. Releasing right in the middle of that season meant that Avengers had to compete with it though, which kind of cannibalized its potential for success. So I mean what I say when I say this. Avengers was a game that was set up for failure from the very beginning. I said it before and I'll say it again here. Underneath all of the games as a service muck, there was a good game here. And it's a shame that Marvel's Avengers didn't get to be what Marvel's Avengers should have been. Maybe in 10 years we'll get another Avengers game on console, but I hate to think that the reason we won't see any more Avengers games anytime soon is all because this game flopped so hard when it really just didn't have to. So what did you think of Marvel's Avengers? I keep hoping that modders are gonna fix the game retroactively, but the mod community for Avengers seems pretty dead, so slim chances of that happening, I guess. So this was originally supposed to be a part of a larger video that included Gotham Knights and Marvel mobile games, so if the video seems a little bit disjointed, that's probably why. I plan on dropping those videos sometime soon. But for now, I'd like to give a shout out to my lovely supporters on Patreon, and I'd also like to show my other videos here. So with all that being said, I've been Swim Team Captain 7 of Super Swim Team 7, signing off.